Good afternoon and welcome to a special afternoon drive. It is, of course, the day before Thanksgiving, and to be honest, I'm just not going to do any politics today. Not even going to really deal with pop culture today. I get sentimental around the holidays, and even though there's a lot that we could say which is happening politically, including political attacks on our holidays, I'm just not in the mood to deal with that today. Right now, my house smells incredible. My wife has just baked an apple pie for dinner tomorrow, and whenever I smell the good aromas coming from the kitchen, especially at holiday time, it takes me back to when I was a kid, when I was at the home of my grandmother at holiday time. She just made holidays very special. And I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's as a kid growing up. Both of my parents worked. I was not in daycare, so when school was not in session, I was at Graham's house till either my mom or dad picked me up on their way home from work. And one of the things that my grandmother did was the radio was on all the time. They weren't big on television, but the radio was always on. And in particular, my grandmother liked to listen to Christian radio, religious radio. But at noontime, she would turn it over to one of the AM talkers, and we would listen to the news and Paul Harvey and the rest of the story. And that was incredible for me as a kid. I was drawn into the way Paul Harvey could give commentary on the news, but in particular, those incredible stories. And so today, this day before Thanksgiving, I'd like to play here, as I am playing for my radio audience, which will air on my Thanksgiving show tomorrow in the Orlando, Daytona Beach radio markets, Paul Harvey's telling of the actual origin of Thanksgiving as a celebration in our nation. I know we talk about pilgrims and Pocahontas, but the actual truth is there's more to the story. And so here to tell it in his own unique way and from a non-revisionist historical perspective, I give you the late Paul Harvey.
No, I will not, declared President Thomas Jefferson. I will not encourage the American people to pray. What he said more precisely was that civil powers alone had been given to the President of the United States, that no authority to direct the religious exercises of his constituents was given to the President of the United States. Well, churchgoers were incensed. They reminded Jefferson that President Washington had proclaimed a national day of prayer. So had President John Adams. But the third President of the United States responded firmly that the Constitution was clear on the matter. If folks wanted to pray, they'd have to do it on their own time, without his urging. And so it was through the two terms of Tom Jefferson. And although Madison, his successor, saw no problem with a president recommending public worship, he agreed that such a presidential proclamation would pose a constitutional disaster. Now, until Jefferson, United States presidents were actually telling people to pray. But this is the rest of the story. Once upon a time, there was a magazine editor named Sarah Josepha Hale, and Sarah Hale vigorously disagreed with Jefferson's perspective on prayer in the presidency. Americans were drifting further from God, she believed. Before they drifted too far, the president must step in and urge a renewal of that relationship. In fact, said Sarah Hale, he must proclaim a day of prayer. And Sarah used her popular Boston Ladies magazine to promote the idea. She began her crusade in 1827. Write your congressman, she told her readers. Pressure the president. And yet, enamored of Tom Jefferson's perspective on the issue, the chief executives who came after him remained determined to separate church and state. But Sarah Hale refused to give up. When her magazine merged with Godey's Ladies' Book of Philadelphia, Sarah found herself with 150,000 readers and the largest periodical of its kind in the nation. And from this enlarged public pulpit, she continued to preach her sermon of government enforced prayer. Through a lot of presidents. For nearly 40 years, Sarah Hale crusaded, writing hundreds of letters to public officials, and getting her readers to write thousands. She published scorching criticisms of those who would stand in her way, and one day, her mission was accomplished. By then, our nation was at war with itself. But in 1863, President Lincoln was in particularly good spirits one day, after a major Union victory at Gettysburg, and he was reading another of those insistent Sarah Hale letters which had been addressed to him personally, and this time the President gave in, and President Lincoln proclaimed a national day of prayer. And you have been observing it ever since. Oh, yes, you have. I know all of your life you've thought of it as a tradition unbroken from the time of the early English settlers, something that may have happened back there at Plymouth Rock. But I tell you, it took a feisty New England publisher named Sarah Hale 4 decades to ensure that tomorrow, by presidential edict, you and I will bow our heads in an expression of gratitude to God in the annual American ritual we've come to know as Thanksgiving. Only now you'll know the rest of the story.
Have a blessed and happy Thanksgiving.